The old galactic empire, ruled by gods and machines, has fallen. In its stead is a reign of chaos, as forces beyond reality try to tear it asunder. In the midst of this galactic chaos, it falls to heroes, both old and new, to take up the reins of power and to rebuild the Star Union that was lost. It shall be a new empire, born of conquest, and from it will emerge a new age. Age of Wonders Planetfall is a turn-based strategy game and sequel to the original Age of Wonders franchise. In this new iteration, you play as an intergalactic military commander, who must travel to a variety of planets that were cut off from one another after a galactic cataclysm, with the hopes of conquering them and reuniting them under a single banner. When you start the game, you'll be able to select from a number of different worlds in both campaign and skirmish mode, with each planet representing a potential different map. Once you've selected which one you're going to try and conquer, you'll be able to select your faction and starting technology. Factions are thematically similar to races in previous Age of Wonders games, and you'll find some that are very aesthetically similar to humans, elves, dwarves, and even the undead. Picking a technology, however, offers you a little bit more customization. These secret technologies basically represent an extra branch on your research tree, and whichever one you pick unlocks new units and upgrades that are only available to the users of that technology. And finally, you can customize your hero, choosing from a few starting loadouts of gear and equipment, as well as appearance and color scheme, although keep in mind during campaign mode some of these options may be restricted. Once you've finished making all of your selections, you'll travel to the targeted world, at which point your spaceship will land and found your starting city. Each map is randomly generated, with different starting locations and resources scattered around. Now, on the surface, Planetfall offers a fairly traditional turn-based strategy experience. On your turn, you can move your armies of units around the map to explore and reveal new terrain. Stockpiles of resources, as well as valuable strategic locations such as farms and mines, are located at different points around the map. Many of these resources will be guarded by alien monsters or neutral factions, and you'll need to fight them if you want to claim the prize. When combat does occur, the game switches over to a tactical map that represents the current battlefield. The tactical combat is also turn-based. When it's your turn, you can move your units around the map and attack. Then your opponent will have the opportunity to do the same. As your units move around the battlefield, you can have them take cover behind walls to break enemy line of sight, or behind obstacles to reduce the accuracy of enemy attacks. Units can also use special abilities such as flamethrowers or grenades to give them an edge in combat. You can also bring your heroes into battle, and in addition to being stronger than your regular troops, they have access to unique weapons and abilities. Also, where previous Age of Wonders games had access to magical spells like lightning bolts and fireballs, in Planetfall you have a limited pool of tactical points which you can use to call in airstrikes and supply drops, which have much the same effect. If your units are victorious in combat, they'll gain experience points and potentially level up. Higher level units have more hit points and possibly more special abilities. You might also gain resources from combat, which can be used to grow and expand your city, either adding new defensive structures such as turrets, or new unit producing facilities such as factories. New soldiers and vehicles can be produced from any of your cities provided you have the factories required to construct them. With enough exploration, you'll eventually uncover other NPC factions who are also trying to conquer the planet. When encountering these other factions, you'll often have to choose between making peace or going to war. After all, there can only be one planetary ruler. Now, what's interesting about Planetfall is that while on the surface it seems pretty traditional, it actually includes a number of 4X strategy elements as well. For instance, the game has multiple victory conditions. While there are always the standard conditions of eliminate all opponents or conquer enough territory, the game also includes alternate conditions as well. For instance, there's a diplomatic victory, where you create the strongest alliance among multiple factions. If you're playing a campaign map, there will often be campaign-specific victories, where you have to complete a number of small side quests before finally moving on to a final ultimate objective. There's even a research victory, where if you get high enough in the tech tree, you can build a doomsday weapon and then just threaten everybody else on the planet into doing what you want. And speaking of research, that's actually another good illustration. Planetfall includes a research subsystem, which by itself is not that unusual. Basically, you use science points to unlock new improvements and unit types, which you can then produce in your cities. Where things get interesting is that you have two tech trees, one for military upgrades and one for society upgrades, which are basically building upgrades. But what's unique is that they are researched in tandem without you having to split your science points, so you are always making progress on both a military technology and a society technology at the same time, which means that you're going to be unlocking both new units and upgrades as well as new facilities for your cities at a steady pace. And speaking of cities, your territory management is another good example of where Planetfall borrows heavily from other contemporary 4X games. You see, all the maps in the game are divided into a number of zones, with each zone having a terrain type and maybe a few bonus resources. You can use a settler to found a single city in each zone, although the restriction is that cities can't be adjacent to one another. Each city also has a population representing its size, and as this population reaches certain thresholds, that city will be able to annex nearby territory, incorporating those extra zones into your empire's territory and gaining any resources that come with them. You can even build specializations in those zones, such as farms or research stations, which will improve their strategic benefits. There are even specialty sectors that are typically guarded by NPC factions, but if subjugated and integrated, can provide you with unique one-of-a-kind bonuses. So what's the good and bad of Planetfall? Well, for starters, I love the pacing of this game. A lot of turn-based strategy games can be kind of bumpy. Either you're engaging in these big combats with your opponent, or you're just sitting there burning through turn after turn, waiting for all your units to get recruited and into position. But in Planetfall, all those extra 4X elements mean that there's a lot more going on. You're not always getting into combat. You're also setting your research. You're managing your cities and their territory. You're checking on your diplomatic status with the other factions, and if you're playing the campaign, you're also going to be completing quests and side objectives as well. And all of this taken together means that every turn there's going to be something requiring your interaction, which is exactly what you want out of a good turn-based strategy game. And a lot of it comes down to the very clever way that the developers divided up their tech tree. In most other strategy games, you have to choose between selecting military upgrades and selecting economic upgrades. But here, in Planetfall, that's not the case. You can research both trees at the same time and unlock new advancements at roughly the same rate. And even the technologies themselves are designed to keep the game moving forward. For instance, right about the time your empire gets large enough that you've got multiple cities that require multiple turns for units to travel between, you'll unlock new transportation technologies that will make that much, much easier. A better example, though, is unit upgrades. Not only does your military tree unlock new types of units, but it also unlocks upgrades which can be used to improve their abilities. Sometimes this means unlocking new weapon types or status effects, but every upgrade, regardless of its type, improves your unit's stats by just a little bit. And this really does facilitate the overall pacing of the game, because it means that even your most basic soldiers with just a few upgrades can still remain competitive into the mid and later stages of the game. And it doesn't hurt that the game has a great selection of units as well. Every faction has a completely different roster of troops to recruit, and the units themselves all have something unique, either an attack or a special ability or a passive bonus that gives them some unique tactical value on the battlefield. Your hero units are the best example of this, able to equip almost any weapon, as well as unlock an expansive skill tree. They represent an excellent mix of both power and flexibility. The presentation of the game is also really nice. The maps are vibrant and colorful. All of the unit models have unique designs with an interesting look that makes them easy to distinguish at a glance. The background and campaign music is a good match for the setting, and the interface is very efficient. Most of your relevant information is displayed right on screen, and getting detailed reports about units, their abilities, or status effects is just a few clicks away. Now, all of that is not to say that I don't have some complaints about the game. For starters, the enemy AI can be a little erratic. Most of the time, when I was making war with NPC factions, I would notice one of two things happening. Either they would march into my territory with overwhelming force and 3 to 4 full stacks of units, or if they thought they were going to lose, they would run back to their base and bunker up, forcing me to repeatedly march across the map and dig them out. But then, if you go to war with one of the independent alien factions, it's the opposite problem, where I would find them literally spawn an army at the edge of my territory and then rush in to attack me, regardless of whether they could win or not. Thankfully, the tactical battles are typically much better, and participating in a giant siege battle with multiple attending armies is always an impressive experience. And yet, ironically, my biggest complaint has to do with the research system. Even though I really like the technology trees in Planetfall and think they contribute a lot towards the overall pacing of the game, I'm not convinced that all of the available options are well balanced. Some of the technologies that are available are just generally practical. Any faction can select them and get a good use out of their unlockable units and abilities. Then there are others that are more specific. For instance, if you choose the plague technology, you get a lot of poisons and drugs, which are useful for both fighting and upgrading biological units. But if you or your opponent are primarily using robots, you're only going to see a fraction of your full potential. And yeah, at the start of the game, you don't have to choose a faction and technology that are theoretically incompatible, but during the campaign missions, you're not always so lucky. And I just think it would have been better to see more general technologies that would have been useful for any faction in any scenario. And speaking of research, I'm honestly not crazy about the game's espionage branch of the technology tree. Early on, it can provide you with a reasonable way of keeping tabs on your opponents, but it takes way too long to unlock useful abilities like stealing money or science points. Also, having to pay to use covert actions means that you already need a strong economy in order to use espionage effectively in the first place. Now, before I tag out, a final note on the DLCs. Planetfall has 3 add-on packs, each of them offering either a new faction or a new technology, with typically an associated mini-campaign included. And if you play the game and like it, then each of those is probably going to be a good investment for you. But the notable addition is the last update, which included a new Galactic Empire feature. Basically, it's an upgraded skirmish mode where you get to pick between a small selection of planets to try and conquer. But if you win, you gain experience points, which can be used to unlock units and tech from the faction that you just used, at which point you can take those unlockables into future games with you, allowing you to customize factions with soldiers and upgrades that they wouldn't normally have access to. It's a really neat addition and adds what is basically a secondary open-ended campaign to the game. Alright then, I would give Age of Wonders Planetfall 4 out of 4 stars, and my recommendation. On the surface, it's a very familiar turn-based strategy game, but they've integrated select elements of other 4X games into the different levels, and the result is an exceedingly well-paced strategy experience. I would definitely recommend this to anybody who's a fan of turn-based strategy games, or if you're a fan of 4X games, but maybe you prefer a more streamlined experience that didn't take quite so long to complete. Alright, well, thanks for listening. Space calls to us all. You stay safe out there. Till next time.